The neon lights of Nexus Point Space Station cast an eerie glow through the smoky air of the Lost Star Bar. In the darkest corner, a figure sat perfectly still, watching the station's inhabitants through eyes that reflected light like polished silver. This was the Shadow, the most feared assassin in the known galaxy, though none of the bar's patrons knew it. They simply felt an instinctive urge to avoid that particular corner. The Shadow's drink remained untouched, just like the last 100 times. Their species didn't need to drink as often as others, but maintaining appearances was important in their line of work. 200 years of perfect contracts had taught them the value of blending in. A small data chip slid across the table. The Shadow didn't look up at the messenger, who hurried away as soon as their task was complete. Only after the messenger's footsteps faded did the Shadow pick up the chip and insert it into their neural reader. The contract details flickered across their vision. The target, James Miller, human cargo pilot. The payment, enough credits to buy a small moon. The Shadow's silver eyes narrowed slightly, the only outward sign of their surprise at the amount. A human. The Shadow whispered to themselves, their voice carrying the slight metallic tone common to their species. Such a high payment for such simple prey. The bar's other patrons continued their loud conversations, completely unaware that the galaxy's deadliest predator was about to begin a new hunt. The Shadow accessed the public records about their target through their neural implant. James Miller appeared to be perfectly ordinary, a freelance cargo pilot who made regular runs between Nexus Point and the outer colonies. No criminal record, no military background, no special training. Just another human trying to make a living in the vast expanse of space. The Shadow's mouth curved into what their species considered a smile, though it would have unsettled most other beings. They had eliminated targets from 47 different species, each with their own unique abilities and defenses. Humans were physically unimpressive compared to many spacefaring races. They had no natural armor, no enhanced strength, no extraordinary sensory abilities. This would be simple. As the Shadow continued reading, a notification popped up in their vision, a warning attached to the contract. Caution advised when targeting human specimens. Reference: Deathworld classification. The Shadow dismissed the warning with a thought. They had seen similar alerts before, usually attached to targets from worlds with high gravity or harsh environments. Such warnings were often exaggerated, spread by beings who relied too heavily on technology and had grown soft. Standing smoothly, the Shadow left their untouched drink and several credits on the table. They moved through the crowded bar without making a sound, their specialized suit absorbing all noise and masking their heat signature. As they passed the bar's main counter, they overheard two merchants discussing their target. "Miller's making another run tomorrow," one merchant said. "Always on time, that one. Boring as they come, but reliable. Heard he survived that pirate's ambush last month," the other replied. "Lucky break, that." The Shadow paused briefly, recording the conversation for later analysis. Luck would not save James Miller from what was coming. Back in their private quarters, the Shadow began preparing for the hunt. Their quarters were sparse, containing only the essentials and their specialized equipment. They accessed the station's scheduling system, noting their target's cargo run planned for the following day. A simple scan revealed the layout of Miller's small apartment and his typical routine. The Shadow species prided themselves on being the galaxy's perfect predators. Their homeworld had forged them through millions of years of evolution into beings of extraordinary capability. They could move in complete silence, see in darkness, and strike with deadly precision. Their lifespans allowed them to master their skills over centuries. The Shadow had spent 200 years becoming death itself. As they checked their equipment, the Shadow received another automated warning about targeting humans. This one was more specific, citing multiple failed assassination attempts by various species. The Shadow found this curious. Failed attempts were rare in their profession, and multiple failures against the same species were nearly unheard of. Still, the Shadow had never failed. Not once in 200 years. They began formulating their approach. The simplest solution would be best, their preferred method of elimination. They produced a small vial containing a clear liquid, a neurotoxin that had proven effective against every species they had ever targeted. It worked by shutting down the target's nervous system, causing a death that appeared natural. The station's artificial night cycle began, dimming the lights in the public areas. The shadow moved through the maintenance corridors, their specialized suit rendering them practically invisible. They reached the ventilation system that fed into Miller's apartment and carefully introduced the toxin. The shadow watched through the apartment's security feeds as James Miller returned home. The human looked tired after a day of cargo manifests and maintenance checks. He walked into the affected area, breathing in the deadly toxin. And nothing happened. The shadow watched with growing confusion as Miller simply yawned, scratched his head, and began preparing his evening meal. The toxin should have killed him within seconds. Instead, the human was humming tunelessly while heating up some preserved food. For the first time in decades, the shadow felt something approaching uncertainty. They ran a diagnostic on their equipment, confirming the toxin had been dispersed correctly. They checked Miller's life signs. His vital readings were completely normal, showing no sign of distress. The human finished his meal and settled into a worn chair, activating the entertainment display. He seemed completely unaffected by a poison that could kill a Hyraxian battle beast in under 5 seconds. The shadow retreated to their quarters, their perfect record suddenly feeling less certain. They began accessing every available piece of information about human biology. The data was frustratingly limited. Humans were relatively new to the galactic community, and much of their biological information was restricted. What they did find was troubling. Humans came from a planet that should have been impossible to evolve on. High gravity, extreme temperature variations, dangerous levels of oxygen, and countless lethal organisms. Most concerning were the notes about human adaptability. Their ability to process toxins, survive extreme conditions, and heal from injuries that would kill most species. The shadow's silver eyes reflected the scrolling data as they read report after report. Their target's apparent boring nature suddenly seemed less like simplicity and more like careful camouflage. The warning about humans being from a death world no longer seemed like bureaucratic overcaution. A new alert caught their attention. Miller's cargo run, scheduled for the next day, had been moved up. The human was already heading to his ship, well ahead of his usual schedule. The shadow's perfect record was at stake, and for the first time, they felt the strange sensation of their own pulse quickening with what lesser beings might call worry. They had underestimated their target, but they were still the galaxy's deadliest assassin. If toxins wouldn't work, they would need to resort to more direct methods. As the shadow gathered their equipment for a new approach, they didn't realize that they had already made their first mistake. They had assumed humans were prey. They were about to learn why that assumption was fatal. The shadow watched from the maintenance shaft as James Miller performed his pre-flight checks. The human moved with casual efficiency, his movements showing no sign of the deadly toxin he had breathed in just hours ago. If anything, he seemed more alert than usual. The assassin had spent the last few hours reviewing their options. Their specialized poison had failed, an unprecedented occurrence that still bothered them. But the shadow hadn't survived 2 centuries by being predictable. They had already prepared their next approach. Miller's ship was a standard cargo hauler, well-maintained but unremarkable. The shadow had easily accessed its systems through the station's maintenance network. Now they waited, silver eyes unblinking, as Miller finished his preparations. "Control, this is Miller. Ready for departure," the human said into his comm unit. His voice was steady, almost cheerful. The shadow noticed he had brought a small container with him. Their enhanced vision identified it as the bottle of hot sauce from his kitchen, the one that had been laced with enough toxin to kill an entire space station's population. The human was actually bringing the poison with him. The shadow felt an unfamiliar sensation. Confusion mixed with a grudging hint of respect. Either Miller was completely unaware of the assassination attempt, or he was far more dangerous than his record suggested. As the cargo ship detached from the station, the Shadow activated their new plan. They had placed a specialized device in the ship's life support system. Once activated, it would slowly replace the oxygen with an inert gas. Every species needed to breathe, after all. Even humans couldn't survive without oxygen. The Shadow returned to their own ship, a sleek vessel hidden among the station's maintenance structures. They monitored Miller's vital signs through the device they had planted. The human's oxygen levels should have been dropping steadily. Instead, Miller's life signs remained stable. The Shadow increased the concentration of inert gas, then checked the feed from the tiny camera they had hidden in the cargo ship's cabin. The human was eating a meal, occasionally taking sips from a battered vacuum flask. The Shadow zoomed in on the ship's environmental readings. Somehow, the oxygen levels in the cabin remained normal. They found the answer in the ship's maintenance log. Miller had installed a mechanical backup life support system, completely separate from the main computer-controlled one. It was primitive technology by galactic standards, but it was keeping him alive. "Smart," the Shadow whispered, their metallic voice carrying a note of appreciation. This human understood something many spacers forgot. Sometimes older technology was more reliable than modern solutions. Time for the next attempt. The Shadow had planted another surprise in Miller's cargo, a container that would release a powerful sedative gas. Even with his backup air supply, the human would have to open the cargo bay at some point. The gas was odorless, colorless, and had knocked out everything from raging Krell warriors to hibernating ice bears. Miller reached the first checkpoint on his route, a small refueling station in a sparse asteroid field. The Shadow watched through the station's security feeds as he began unloading cargo. The gas should have been releasing into the cargo bay. The human walked into the cargo bay, and the Shadow leaned forward slightly, waiting for him to collapse. Instead, Miller stopped, sniffed the air, and frowned. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device, an atmospheric tester. The Shadow realized with growing disbelief. "Control, we've got a leak in here," Miller reported calmly. "Some kind of gas. Running analysis now." He checked the device's readings and actually chuckled. "Looks like one of the medical supply containers cracked. Just sedative gas, though. Nothing toxic. Good thing I always check." The Shadow watched in growing frustration as Miller sealed off the cargo bay, vented the gas into space, and continued his work as if nothing had happened. Their target wasn't just surviving their attempts. He was treating them as minor inconveniences. As Miller finished refueling, the Shadow noticed something odd about his behavior. The human was moving differently now. His casual manner seemed more deliberate, his random movements forming a pattern. He was searching for something, the Shadow realized, or someone. The assassin accessed the station's security feeds, scanning the crowds. Their enhanced vision caught a flicker of movement, another being trying very hard not to be noticed. Someone else was watching Miller. The human completed his business and prepared to leave. Just before he boarded his ship, he paused and looked directly at the security camera the Shadow was watching through. He smiled and gave a small wave. The Shadow felt their pulse quicken again. That hadn't been a random gesture. Somehow, Miller knew he was being watched. Back on their own ship, the Shadow began a deeper investigation into their target. They accessed restricted databases, calling in favors from contacts throughout the galaxy. The official record showed nothing unusual, just a cargo pilot with a clean record and modest success. But there were gaps in that record, small inconsistencies that the Shadow's centuries of experience helped them notice. Miller's ship registration was only 3 years old, but the way he handled the vessel suggested decades of experience. His cargo routes often took him through dangerous sectors, yet he had never lost a shipment. The pirate attack the merchants had mentioned. There were no official reports about it. The Shadow's silver eyes narrowed as they found something else, a pattern in Miller's cargo manifests. He often transported medical supplies and basic provisions, but hidden in the ordinary shipments were components that could be used for advanced security systems, the kind of security that could detect assassination attempts. Their target's apparent luck in surviving the attempts suddenly seemed less like luck and more like preparation. The simple cargo pilot was beginning to look more like a carefully crafted cover identity. The Shadow received an alert. Miller's ship was changing course. Instead of heading to his planned destination, he was moving toward a dense asteroid field, the kind of place where sensors would be unreliable and ships could easily disappear. He was trying to draw them out. For the first time in 2 centuries of hunting, the Shadow felt something close to doubt. Everything they had tried, the nerve toxin, the oxygen displacement, the sedative gas, hadn't just failed. They had failed in ways that suggested Miller had encountered such attempts before. The Shadow remembered the warning about humans being a death world species. They accessed more historical data, looking for records of other assassination attempts against humans. The results were disturbing. There were dozens of recorded attempts, but very few confirmed successes. And those that had succeeded, the assassins had never been heard from again. A new message flashed across their vision. A general alert to all ships in the sector. A cargo container had been found floating in space, leaking toxic gas. The warning listed the exact chemical composition of the Shadow's favorite poison. Miller wasn't just surviving the attempts on his life. He was gathering evidence. The Shadow watched as their target's ship disappeared into the asteroid field. They had a choice to make. Follow him into terrain he had clearly chosen for a confrontation. Or, what? Admit defeat. Break a contract for the first time in 2 centuries. Their silver eyes reflected the distant light of the asteroids as they made their decision. They had never failed a contract, and they weren't going to start now. But as they plotted a course to follow Miller's ship, the Shadow couldn't shake the feeling that they were no longer the predator in this hunt. The real question was, had they ever been? The asteroid field stretched out before the Shadow's ship like a maze of spinning rocks and hidden dangers. Their sensors were already showing interference, just as they had expected. This was exactly the kind of place where a hunter could become the hunted. The Shadow had lost visual contact with Miller's ship 10 minutes ago, but they could still track its energy signature. The human was moving deeper into the field, following a path that seemed random at first glance. But the Shadow had been hunting too long to believe in random paths. Clever, they muttered, their metallic voice barely audible even in their own ship's cabin. Miller was using the larger asteroids to mask his ship's signature, while staying just visible enough to be followed. He was laying a trail, and the Shadow was being invited to follow it. It was clearly a trap. 200 years of experience screamed at the Shadow to pull back, to wait for a better opportunity. But their perfect record was at stake, and something else they didn't quite understand. A burning need to prove they could overcome this unexpectedly difficult prey. The Shadow's ship slipped between 2 slowly rotating asteroids, its advanced stealth systems making it nearly invisible. They had disabled all non-essential systems to minimize their energy signature. If Miller wanted to play hide and seek, the Shadow would show him what real stealth looked like. A sudden alert flashed across their vision. An energy spike directly ahead. The Shadow's reflexes, honed over centuries, sent their ship into an immediate dive. A fraction of a second later, a concentrated burst of electromagnetic energy passed through the space where their ship had been. An EMP trap, powerful enough to disable every system on their ship. If it had hit, they would have been left floating helplessly in space. The trap had been perfectly placed, taking advantage of the asteroid field's natural layout to force any pursuing ship into its range. The Shadow's silver eyes narrowed as they analyzed what had just happened. The trap hadn't been set recently. The devices were covered in space dust, perfectly masked to look like natural mineral formations. This particular trap had been waiting here for months, possibly years. This wasn't just Miller's escape route. This was his hunting ground. Another alert. Movement behind one of the larger asteroids. The Shadow caught a glimpse of Miller's cargo ship, but something was different. Panels had shifted on its hull, revealing what looked like military-grade weapon systems. The simple cargo hauler was transforming before their eyes. Definitely not just a cargo pilot, the Shadow whispered, a new respect creeping into their voice. They began accessing restricted military databases through their neural implant, searching for any record of a human operative matching Miller's description. The search was interrupted by a direct communication request from Miller's ship. The Shadow hesitated, then accepted the transmission. Their communication system was heavily encrypted and couldn't be traced back to them. "You know," Miller's voice came through clearly, sounding as casual as if he was chatting at a spaceport bar. "Most folks would have given up after the first few attempts." There was no fear in his voice, not even concern. He sounded almost amused. The Shadow remained silent, analyzing every background noise from the transmission for useful information. "The poison was pretty impressive," Miller continued. "Had to dig deep in the archives to identify that one. Haven't seen it used since the Outer Rim conflicts. That was you too, wasn't it? The Shadow. The assassination of the rebel leader." The Shadow's pulse quickened slightly. That contract had been over 100 years ago, and all records of it had been erased. Yet this human knew about it. "Your reputation's well earned," Miller went on. "But I think it's time we had a proper chat about who hired you. Because this isn't about me. It's about what I'm carrying. Or more specifically, who I'm working for." A data packet accompanied his words. "Coordinates for a small mining station nearby." The Shadow's scans showed it was automated, no crew present. "Choice is yours," Miller said. "Meet me there for a talk, or keep playing cat and mouse until one of us makes a mistake. Though I should mention, humans are really, really good at not being the ones who make that mistake first." The transmission ended, leaving the Shadow with a decision to make. Their programming and pride demanded they continue the hunt, but 2 centuries of survival instinct told them something else. They were dealing with someone who had been 3 steps ahead of them from the start. The Shadow began scanning the mining station. It was exactly what it appeared to be. An automated facility for processing ore from the asteroid field. But they found something else, something that made their silver eyes widen slightly. The station's design was old, using technology that predated modern computer systems. Just like Miller's backup life support. They remembered how their target had survived the toxin, how he had casually dealt with the sedative gas, how these traps had been laid out long before the Shadow took this contract. Everything pointed to one conclusion. Miller hadn't just been prepared for their assassination attempts. He had been prepared for anyone's assassination attempts. The Shadow's ship glided toward the mining station, their mind racing through possibilities. In 200 years, they had never negotiated with a target, never even considered it. But they had also never encountered a target who had so thoroughly turned their own hunting ground against them. As they approached the station, they noticed something that their centuries of experience told them was impossible. The station's defenses were powered down. Miller was actually giving them a clear approach, offering a genuine chance to talk. That's when the Shadow understood their biggest mistake. They had assumed that surviving on a death world meant humans were simply hard to kill. But Miller was showing them something else, something far more dangerous. Humans hadn't just survived their deadly homeworld. They had learned to master it, to turn its dangers to their advantage. The Shadow docked their ship at the station, engaging every security measure they had. As they prepared to meet their target face to face, they realized that Miller had taught them something no other target had in 2 centuries of hunting. Sometimes the most dangerous prey isn't the one that fights back hardest, but the one that's smart enough to change the rules of the hunt itself. The station's airlock cycled, and the Shadow heard heavy boots on metal grating. Miller was coming to meet them, but for the first time in their long career, the Shadow wasn't sure who was really hunting whom. The mining station's corridors were dimly lit by emergency lighting, casting long shadows that would have provided perfect cover for the Shadow's species. But as they waited in the station's main control room, they realized something unsettling. The low-light conditions might actually be giving Miller the advantage. The human's boots echoed on the metal floor, getting closer. The shadow had positioned themselves in the darkest corner of the room, their specialized suit making them nearly invisible. Yet when Miller entered, he looked directly at their hiding spot. "The thing about humans," Miller said casually, as if continuing their earlier conversation, "is that we evolved as pursuit predators. Our ancestors would track prey for days, following trails that other species couldn't even see." He was wearing a simple pressure suit, no visible weapons. "We're pretty good at noticing little details, like the way shadows don't quite match up when there's someone hiding in them." The shadow stayed perfectly still. In 2 centuries, no one had ever spotted them this easily. "You can stay hidden if you want," Miller continued, walking to the room's central console. "But since we're both professionals here, maybe we could talk face to face." He pulled out a familiar bottle, the one containing the shadow's deadly toxin. "I brought refreshments." The shadow emerged from their hiding spot, moving with liquid grace. "You knew about the poison from the start." "Of course," Miller smiled. "Just like I knew about the sedative gas, the oxygen displacement, and the other 3 backup plans you had ready. The real question is, did you know about the 7 different ways I could have killed you since you entered this station?" The shadow's silver eyes narrowed. "You're not a cargo pilot." "Oh, I am actually." "That part's true. I just happen to be other things as well." Miller leaned against the console. "Former special operations, specialized in counter-assassination techniques. These days I work security for certain interested parties, the kind of parties that someone wants to keep from meeting." The shadow processed this information. "The cargo manifests. The medical supplies were cover for something else." "Smart." Miller nodded. "I'm supposed to be escorting a diplomatic delegation next week. Someone really doesn't want that meeting to happen. They hired the best assassin in the galaxy to take out the escort in advance. That would be you." The shadow felt their pulse quicken again. This wasn't just a difficult target. This was a complete operation that had been blown before it even started. "How long have you known?" "About the contract." 3 weeks before it was offered to you." "About you specifically." "Since the first time you walked into the Lost Star to observe me." Miller's eyes showed a predatory gleam that looked disturbingly familiar to the shadow. "We've been watching you for a long time. You're good. The best, actually. That's why they chose you. And that's exactly why we leaked those gaps in my security." The shadow understood suddenly. "You wanted them to hire me." "Bingo." Miller straightened up. "See, someone's been taking out human diplomatic escorts across 3 sectors. Very professional work, very untraceable. Sound familiar?" "The Silent Wars," the shadow said quietly. "A series of assassinations that had destabilized peace talks between various species over the past year." "Exactly. But the assassins were all different. The only connection was the level of skill involved. Someone's been hiring the best in the business, using them to keep certain parties from talking to each other. Parties that might compare notes about who's really pulling strings in this sector." The shadow remained still, their mind racing through implications. "You set a trap. Not for me specifically. For whoever was behind the contracts," Miller finished. "We needed one of the top-tier assassins to make a mistake, to give us a trail to follow. And you, my friend, are the best there is. If anyone could lead us to the source, it would be you." The shadow felt something they hadn't experienced in centuries. They had been outmaneuvered completely. "My employer uses cutouts, layers of deniability. Even I don't know who they are. But your payment processing does." Miller smiled again. "Every credit transfer leaves traces, no matter how well hidden. While we've been playing cat and mouse out here, my colleagues have been backtracing your expected payment. By now, they should have a location." The shadow's neural implant pinged. Someone was trying to access their secure payment protocols. They had multiple layers of security, but the thing about human intelligence operations, Miller continued, is that we learned from our own history. On Earth, The most successful hunters didn't just track their prey. They set up ambush points, used terrain to their advantage, and most importantly, they worked in teams. Multiple alarms flashed across the Shadow's vision. Their backup accounts were being accessed. Emergency protocols were being triggered. Someone was unraveling 2 centuries of carefully hidden trails. Right about now, Miller said, checking his watch, your employer should be realizing that their entire network is compromised. The other assassins they hired are being tracked down. Safe houses are being raided. All because they made one simple mistake. They assumed humans were just another species to be hunted. The Shadow had never felt trapped before. They had always had escape routes, contingencies, but as more alerts flashed across their vision, they realized Miller had led them exactly where he wanted them. So here's the deal, Miller said, his casual tone unchanged but his eyes hard as steel. You can try to complete your contract. Maybe you'll even succeed. Humans can die after all. But you won't survive it, and everything you've built over 2 centuries will be gone anyway. Or you can tell us everything you know about these contracts. Help us find who's really behind this. Walk away with your reputation mostly intact. Maybe even pick up some new clients who appreciate your professionalism. The Shadow stared at the human, understanding finally hitting them with full force. This hadn't been an assassination attempt that failed. This had been a counterintelligence operation from the start, and they had played their part perfectly. 200 years, the Shadow said quietly. No failed contracts. Think of it this way, Miller offered. You're not failing the contract. You're accepting a better offer. That's just good business. More alerts flashed through the Shadow's neural feed. Their entire network was being systematically exposed. 2 centuries of perfect operations, undone because they had underestimated a single human. No, they realized, not a single human. An entire species that had turned their Death World origins into a galaxy-wide intelligence network. A species that had seen them coming before they had even taken the contract. The Shadow had always considered themselves the galaxy's perfect predator. But as they looked at Miller's confident smile, they understood. Humans hadn't just survived as prey on their hostile world. They had evolved into something far more dangerous. Predators who could think like prey, and prey who could hunt like predators. The Shadow made their decision. A week later, the Shadow sat in their usual dark corner of the Lost Star Bar, watching the station's inhabitants with their silver eyes. But this time, they were seeing everything differently. Every movement, every conversation, every casual gesture could be part of something larger. The humans had taught them that. Their neural feed was still rebuilding after the systematic dismantling of their network. But strangely, their reputation hadn't suffered as Miller had predicted. If anything, it had grown. Word had spread through the galactic underworld. The Shadow had survived an encounter with human intelligence operations. Not just survived, but emerged as something even more dangerous. An assassin who could admit when they were outmatched. The Shadow's attention focused on the bar's main entrance as Miller walked in. The human moved through the crowd with that same casual confidence. But now the Shadow could see the predator's awareness behind it. Miller ordered a drink and made his way to their corner. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, sitting without waiting for an answer. "Nice work last week. The information you provided helped us round up the entire operation. Turns out a certain corporate consortium was trying to prevent alliance talks between human colonies and several outer rim worlds. They thought keeping us isolated would make us easier to control." The Shadow's metallic voice carried a hint of amusement. "They made the same mistake I did, thinking humans were just another species to be manipulated." Miller took a sip of his drink. "It's a common error. Everyone looks at our physical capabilities, our relatively short lifespans, our lack of natural weapons. They never consider that surviving on Earth meant developing something far more dangerous than claws or armor. Intelligence networks," the Shadow said. "The ability to coordinate, to turn individual weaknesses into group strengths." "Exactly." Miller nodded. A lone human might not be a match for many species, but humans are never really alone. We learned on Earth that survival doesn't always mean being the strongest. Sometimes it means being the best at working together, at sharing information, at turning every defeat into a lesson for the next encounter. The Shadow's silver eyes reflected the bar's neon lights. Your trap was well designed, using my own reputation against me, making me think I was hunting you while you were actually hunting my employers. To be fair, you're not the first assassin they hired who helped us in the end. Miller smiled. Though you are the first who figured it out before we had to make things messy. That's why I'm here, actually. We have a proposition for you. The Shadow remained silent, waiting. Humanity is expanding into the galaxy, making allies, building trade routes. But there are always forces that oppose cooperation, that profit from conflict. We need people who can help us identify threats before they become problems. People with your particular set of skills. You're offering me a job, the Shadow stated, their metallic voice neutral. More like a partnership. You keep your independence, your other contracts, as long as they don't conflict with human interests. In return, you get access to our intelligence networks, our resources, and most importantly, our trust. That's something no amount of credits can buy. The Shadow considered this. In 2 centuries of taking contracts, they had never allied themselves with any particular faction. But humans had shown them something new. The value of being part of something larger than individual hunts. The consortium you helped us catch wasn't working alone, Miller continued. There are others out there, bigger players hiding in the shadows. They think humanity's cooperative nature is a weakness they can exploit. We need to show them why that's a fatal mistake. The Shadow remembered how thoroughly Miller and his colleagues had dismantled their operation, not through superior strength or advanced technology, but through patience, preparation, and perfect coordination. You're building a network of former adversaries, turning potential threats into assets. That's another thing we learned on Earth, Miller said. The best way to survive isn't to kill all your competitors. It's to convince them that working together is more profitable than working against each other. A new alert flashed across the Shadow's vision. Their first official contract offer from Human Intelligence Services. The payment was substantial, but what caught their attention were the operational details. The humans weren't just offering money, they were offering knowledge, access to their methods, their ways of thinking. Consider it a chance to learn some new hunting techniques, Miller said, standing up. After all, humans have been practicing the art of survival longer than most species realize. We just do it differently than everyone expects. The Shadow watched as Miller walked away, leaving them with a decision to make. Their perfect record as an assassin was already broken, but something new was being offered in its place, a chance to evolve, just as humans had evolved on their deadly homeworld. Their silver eyes scanned the contract details one more time. Then, for the first time in 2 centuries, the Shadow did something completely unexpected. They smiled, their metallic features reflecting the neon lights as they accepted the offer. After all, they had learned the most important lesson any predator could learn. Sometimes the best way to remain deadly was to change how you hunt. In the bustling space station, surrounded by beings from 100 different worlds, the Shadow began their new role. Not just as the galaxy's deadliest assassin, but as something far more dangerous, a hunter who had learned from humanity's greatest strength. The ability to turn every defeat into an opportunity, every enemy into a potential ally, and every ending into a new beginning. And somewhere in the station, James Miller smiled, knowing the humans had just gained another powerful ally in the vast, dangerous galaxy. Because that's what humans did best. They didn't just survive. They adapted, they learned, and most importantly, they taught others that cooperation could be the deadliest weapon of all.